I think there's so many cultural and confounding factors that are moving in all of these conversations about gender, conversations about race, conversations about vaccines. Like all of this has been, we can't talk about it. And if you do, you're bad and you're anti. And that's actually been the hardest part, is if you just want to have a conversation, you're instantly put in this box of anti. But all these incredibly good human beings actually just want to have a conversation, and they want to understand. I want to understand. And I feel like, for you and I, and for other people who are willing to have this conversation, it's important that we do take the grenades, because we have to model what it means to be two adults who are curious, that if I offend you, you get to say, hey, actually, that didn't feel good for me. And I get to learn something, and, vice versa. But the fact that we can have this without reactivity, and like, I know that when this conversation is done, we're going to have cultivated a deeper relationship, and other people listening are going to have learned so much, which again, I just have to keep saying, thank you for being brave, because what has been the response of the maybe more aggressive activists to your openness?
Well, before I answer that, I'll say I try to be very careful how I use words like hate and transphobia. Because like you mentioned earlier on in this conversation, those words are being misused. There is a crowd that uses it for anything that they don't want to talk about. You want to have that conversation about washrooms? That's transphobic to talk about it. And I can't accept that. We have to be able to have conversations. So I reserve those words for when people have a genuine disdain and contempt towards me about my identity. And that does exist. There are those people out there. That's not most people. That's very, very, very few people. And I think that's why I can have the conversations that I have, because there's these whole crowds of people that get shut out from even knowing a transgender person because they have a concern, because they don't know something, because they are uncomfortable being forced to use pronouns that don't feel authentic to them. And they're kind of told, well, you are transphobic because you won't do this thing. Or maybe they even just mess up pronouns sometimes because it's hard. I get it. I have a low voice. It's easy to say he, him. And so I push through that by saying, no, it's transphobic if you have contempt for me and you're trying to hurt me. If you come at me, with disdain, then that's hate. If you come at me with an open heart and you want to get to know me, I don't care what you say. I will never consider that to be hateful. That's always an opportunity to have a relationship. And so that's allowed me to make a lot of close connections across our political spectrum and across the spectrum of opinions on transgender matters. I have friends who are transgender. I have friends who are deeply progressive, but that carries over to I have friends who are gender critical. I have friends who are very conservative, who are very religious. And these people just want to love, as we all want to love. And I try to create that space where we can connect. However, there are those factions, especially on the extremes, where hate really does live and thrive. And so for me, I kind of have three different categories of hate that I've conceptualized myself. The one is the trans rights activists themselves. So these are people who are pushing strongly for transgender rights, but it's very rooted in a postmodern way of conceptualizing the space. And so they tend to have a very rigid oppressor mindset. And the world of non-transgender people oppresses transgender people, and we have to push back against them. And so to them, me talking to these people who they view as the problem simply because they have a concern or two about a policy or something that's going on, they then view me as a big threat because I'm giving legitimacy to these people and I'm kind of propping these people up by being transgender and engaging with them and having community with them. So I do get a lot of hate from that group. And then there is the far ends of the religious space. Again, I have tons of friends who are religious, and I think it's wonderful. I spent 30 years in an evangelical church, so it's definitely a space that I know and I love dearly. But there's obviously certain factions where hate flourishes in religion, where the attitude's not follow Jesus and love. The attitude is you must believe this and you must be like this, or we're going to direct hate towards you. So that does exist as well. And then the third group that I think not everybody is aware exists is what's known as radical feminism. So the radical feminists, it's a movement that comes out of the 70s, and it uses that same postmodern mindset that the trans rights activists utilize of an oppressor mindset. But to them, it's men are the oppressor and women are the oppressed. And of course, in all of these spaces, whether we're talking about transgender, whether we're talking about man-woman divides, there's an element of oppression, there's an element of privilege. These things do have some merit, But it's easy for people in these spaces to fall into an all or nothing perspective where they can see men as the problem with everything in their life. It's always men, it's always oppression. And so for these people, transgender women specifically are the physical embodiment of, men taking their form and erasing them.
That's interesting.
And so they have these very, very specific talking points they tend to utilize in that space of, the erasure of women, and they'd call what I am women face because I'm mocking them. And that's actually the meanest, harshest group towards most transgender people. And so that's a group that I've encountered as well. And that's actually been a part of what I want to do, is to create a very clear distinction between people who really do hate transgender people because they're radical feminists or because they're extremely religious, and people who just have concerns. People like Nick Morabito, I mentioned, who wants to talk about washrooms, or people who say, I'm really concerned about our prisons and some of the policies going on there, but I have no problem with someone like Julia existing. I just think we need to rethink this policy a bit. And I'm trying to separate those two groups so that we can have the conversations we need to have, and also more clearly identify where hate is.